I am thrilled today to have a legend, an MSP legend, an M&A legend on this video with me today, Gary Pica, founder of TruMethods. Gary, thank you. I could go on and on and talk about your resume. You started, it looks like you started in sales. Am I correct to say you started as in a sales role, or did you,
Yes,
you're not a
I was
technical
a
person?
salesperson from the time I graduated college for over 10 years until I got involved with my first MSP.
Yeah, and how
I
did that?
consider myself still, at my heart, I consider myself first and foremost a professional salesperson.
Yeah, and you're great at that. It's interesting, I've had the luxury or the honor of watching you work quite a bit. I was for come to some TruMethods meetings.
Yeah.
I've been blown away sitting in meetings with you, and I'll learn more in like a minute listening to you from a sales perspective, but also operation. I've never seen, you've got a great mind for running an operationally effective business and just everything about running an MSP. So
I
it's
appreciate that. That really, um, it's great to be able to sell, but if you don't really understand um, the business enough to package and price it correctly, to deliver it at margin, you get stuck. And so we see a lot of companies that a lot of them can't sell, and a lot of them that can sell get stuck because of those other things. So it's an operational business.
So, Gary, what I'd like to do in our time together today, and as a leader in the MSP, in the M&A industry, as a leader, as kind of as Frank DiBenedetto said, an M&A legend. You've done this a couple times, and actually, how many times before I even ask you the first question, how many M&A deals have you been involved with? I know you've done
Ooh.
it twice on your own, but coaching and advising from a
Yeah.
profession, how many
So
M&A deals?
if I think about it, I've sold two MSPs and TruMethods. So I've sold three companies that I built and scaled. When I had my first MSP, we acquired a few small MSPs, so I did that. Um, I've at one point I helped some of my friends in the industry, represented them on their deals. That's another handful. And then today I sit on the board of two private equity backed MSPs. And so have been involved with probably seven or eight acquisitions, on that side. So a lot. I've seen it from all sides, right? Being a small, just an MSP that's, singly owned, buying, selling mine, and then from the PE perspective, doing acquisitions.
So, and I'm going to go forward before I'm going to still go back to my first question. I haven't asked you my first question yet, but this is popping in my head. So as the leader of TruMethods, you're coaching, you're with many
Nearly
MSPs. I don't know.
500 MSPs every quarter.
Okay. How many of them have you watched sell their MSP? Because you're involved in those acquisitions as well as probably.
Some of them, or most of them at least, call me, based on what they're doing. Um, we just asked the question at our member event, Schnizzfest, and it was hard from stage to see how many people have sold their business in the last year. But I'm gonna guess there was like at least 10 or more people in the room that had sold their business. We had a little glass of champagne that we had carried around to them. Um, so yeah, it's increasing.
Yeah, and it's amazing, and that's why I say, you've been involved in these acquisitions yourself as a buyer seller, but you get to kind of see the whole industry, and that's incredible. Um, so I want to back up to when you first got into your first MSP. I'd like to explore what was Gary Pica, the green new MSP like? Like, was it, you know, and I'm going to say something, when I see people who go into a business as from a sales side, usually they have a different lens than a technician side
Yeah.
because the technician is not there, and I think you probably went into it a little more with your eyes wide open than say a technician would have. Technicians got to go
Yeah.
and learn. But what were you like? What was it like for Gary?
So I was young. I mean, I was a young guy. immature in a lot of ways. And although I knew sales, I'd never run a business and I didn't know technology. So there was a lot of things I didn't have. And MSP was not yet MSP. So it was really hard going through that evolution. What I'll say is when I invested in and bought the second MSP, I didn't work in that one, things happened much faster because I had built out like the playbook, what people now know as Peaconomics. And so there was no source. It was trial and error. And so I made a lot of mistakes before getting things figured out to the point where we could scale. The second time around, and I would say today, watching our peer members who come in, it's a much better time to build this business right now. We have security as a wedge. We have customers, SMBs who invest more in technology as a percentage of revenue. More of them are using MSP. So in every way, the market is so much better today to scale an MSP if you know how.
So you said you had some challenges and you did the smart thing. You know, not a lot of people do this. I'm still one day I'm going to still do this myself is document the process and create a system around it. You know, you created a system called Peaconomics and that's why you can now rinse and repeat, right? Like, but what were some of those mistakes you made? Like what were some of the lessons learned or missteps or
I say the top ones would be the same ones I see when I meet people for the first time. They don't have command over the key cost drivers in their business. So number one, having defined roles and responsibilities. People, they get stuck, even if they have 10 or 15 employees, it's almost like everybody's doing everything, you know? And we had very defined roles for support desk and proactive and VCIO and centralized services and all of those things. And then step two was, okay, what are the key drivers to increase leverage, more revenue per role? And then do I have command over the cost and especially cost per seat, so I know how to price and sell the value. So that really is what I would say, having defined roles and then developing command over the economics so that every person in the business has daily and weekly and monthly metrics that tie back to the success of the company. Almost no one has that when we meet them.
let's explore what kind of numbers you're looking for or when you're coaching somebody, what specifically are those numbers and how do they work and how do you figure all that out?
So let's do it in like, let's talk about enterprise value, what your company is worth. Like, how does that get determined? And there's a lot of factors. I'm going to try to like simplify this. There's 20 things. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the big drivers and a logic to look at it. Companies like MSPs and many others, except for like some software companies and certain industries, they're valued on a multiple of EBITDA, which is really kind of cash flow. You can think of it as cash flow, right? And so what drives your value is determining what is EBITDA. And it's like not an exact formula, right? You got to have your books lined up right. You have what's called add backs, things that you think you should add back to that number. A buyer may agree or disagree. So agreeing on that number, it's a range, normally what it is. And then once you have that, there's some multiple of that EBITDA that determines the value. So they're the two drivers. And that multiple, a lot of things affect it. One is your scale. So if you generate $500,000 of annual EBITDA, that's a much lower multiple than if you generate 2.5 million a year, right? So that's a big driver. The more you have, the percentage, whether you're doing it, how much revenue you need to do that. So if your EBITDA percentage is 10% compared to 20%, that changes the value. And then your customer base, your average price, the customer distribution. Do you have clients that are real big at risk? So all of these things go into it. If you know what those factors are, and again, in our peer group, we try to make sure we teach this over and over again, you can make decisions, right, to maximize your enterprise value. And here's the thing. even if you think you never want to sell your company, they're still the right things because they're risk factors. And the same way that professional people, like how we look at companies when we buy them, because they don't want to buy that risk. If you don't sell, you have that risk. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a great business, what I tell people is know these factors, make decisions by them, because a great business to sell is also a great business to own. A company that has the right customer base, the right distribution, the right price, the right percentage of profit, the right gross margins, the right growth rate. All of those things is a great company to own.
Let's back up to your first sale. You tell us about how your MSP was structured. Did you have partners? Did you how did that first sale to the first company go? Or actually maybe we even back up because I know you bought some MSPs in there. So did you buy MSPs before you sold your first
Yeah,
or
small ones. Like, and what I learned from that was we weren't really qualified to buy companies, which I find with a lot of MSPs, that's one lesson that I tell people. It's like, if you're running a small MSP, especially if it's not optimized, are you really qualified now to buy a company, value it, integrate it? We're not. And so we ended up, we could only afford to buy companies smaller than us. And what we ended up buying was like a customer base that we really didn't want, with hopes that we could fix it. So that's the mistake we made there. And then when it came time for us to sell, this, I'll take you through this logic because I think this is really important, right? And this is kind of the logic I go through. I get on the phone with someone, they say, hey, we got an LOI, a letter of intent. Somebody wants to buy the business. And they'll tell me, like, I'll ask them questions. Okay, what's the offer first? Two, let's look at your key financial indicators. So we'll kind of look at that. But then I ask them, can I ask you questions like, what percentage of the business do you own? What is your net worth outside of the business? Can you tell me how it's structured, like what it is? And then we look at their age and say, okay, here's what it's going to look like post-tax. So your post-tax, you get this, plus you have that. And most of the time, many MSPs, the reason it's hard to sell the business is they don't have a lot of net worth outside the business. It's all tied up in the business. And so I'll pull up like a retirement calculator and say, okay, here's how much you'll have after this. You're 48 years old. You could live to be, 92. Great. You're going to have it great for like 15 years. Then you're done. It goes like this. And so really thinking about what is the impact. And so here's the logic when I sold my MSP. What I was in my early 40s. It was not enough money, nearly enough money for me to live the rest of my life. So in one ways, it freed me up to go do other things, which was TruMethods, which I didn't know at the time. And the other way, it added some stress because I said, well, look, I can't spend any of that money. I got to go out at the minimum case. I got to go out and make enough money to pay all my bills, do all those things to let that money grow. And it's almost like I make the joke. I don't know. Have you ever watched the show Succession?
Mhm.
So in the show Succession, Tom says to young cousin Greg, hey, what's your number? He's like, what do you mean? It's like, what's the number amount money you think you need? And Greg says 5 million. And Tom laughs and says, that's the worst amount of millions. And what he meant by that was not that 5 million is not a lot of money, but as a young guy, you can't live on 5 million the rest of your life. So you have to invest it. And now you got to go out and earn a living, but it's hard to earn a living and do things when you have money in the bank and you're not really living the lifestyle of a multimillionaire, or else it's like you get caught in between. So I always go through that kind of personal. Same thing when we look to acquire a company. I try to get that relationship and take them through because I want to make sure everybody has their eyes wide open. So that's something really to think about.
So you were very candid when you were talking about selling your first MSP. You couldn't go and retire on that. You went out and you had enough to go create a new business called TruMethods, which is huge. But if you could go
But I
back
didn't
in
know
time,
that.
what's that?
But I didn't know that at the
You
time.
didn't know that at the time,
Yeah.
but if you could go back in time, like, would you coach your, how would you coach yourself now based on what you know and what you've been through? Would you have told yourself, no, wait a minute, let's not sell yet. Let's do this and this before we sell?
Okay, so that's a good question. And I got asked it because I was in the peer group and I stayed in the peer group during my earnout period. So I had an earnout, I had goals to hit. So I was running the business after I sold it for a few years. And the business did really well in those years. Part of it was I was way more focused on sales and EBITDA because that's what my earnout was based on. And I stopped worrying about a lot of other things, which was a good lesson to learn that I shouldn't have been worried about anyway. So that's a separate podcast that we can do about that lesson that I learned. But they all said to me, like, dude, do you wish you had kept your company? Like, look how much more it would be worth, like 35% more in this short time frame. And number one, I never look back on decisions that I make. I make them with the best decision. I look forward, I make it the right decision. But even knowing that, Mike, I'll be honest, I would have made the same decision because I probably wouldn't be here
Mhm.
with you on this podcast if I hadn't made that decision. There's not only a value to money, but there's a value to time, right?
Right.
And it allowed me to start TruMethods at a great time in the industry. Like the timing was, in hindsight, was really good. 3 years later, it might not have been as good, right? And I might have got more money for it and might not have been as motivated. And there's so many, you can't second guess all that. Part of this is, I just had this conversation with someone who's thinking about selling yesterday. And I said to him, look, one, think about you first. Like, what do you want to do? Where are you in your business? And at your age, do you want to do something else besides run an MSP? Right? Like, think about I call that the art of it that you have to do, the soul searching. I said, the other part of it's a math problem, dude, which is where are you now? What's your enterprise valuation? If you can have some co-investment into the new deal, what's that? What's the total value after taxes? And then what do you make now paying ordinary income on? And let's just say, like, are you, I've known you for 8 years. Are you telling me you're going to do twice as good in 2 years? Have you seen anybody in our peer group do that? Like this is a slow, steady business. So be realistic. And then you have both. You have the money side, you have kind of what you want to do, and the time side. And you have to have your hands on all three of those levers to make a good, clear decision.
It's an awesome answer. And I'm going to give a little short commercial. We'll do this again later, but you got to be in TruMethods, a true peer. If you are not, I mean, if you have no idea, if you're on this watching this and you're like, what is TruMethods? What is true peer? You better get on this, because Peaconomics, all the stuff that Gary's talking about, and just being in a peer group, being in with experts who've been there, done that. It's
Yeah,
like having a blueprint.
we have, I don't know why, if you're an MSP, you want to be in this business right now with as fast as it's changing and not be in an industry peer group. I'm going to say I feel like ours is the best. Like we have
I
this thing
agree.
dialed
100%.
in every way, and we know how to run a high performing MSP. We have the TruMethods framework, economics. But having said that, you got to be in an industry peer group right now, or you're not growing as fast or not as profitable as you could be if you were.
Yeah, almost every MSP I talk to that's not a part of a peer group is miles behind their counterparts.
And
So
if your
that's
group has the biggest percentage growth of MRR in a year, you get a Super Bowl ring.
awesome. I love it. I love what you guys do. Gary, I want to end with this question here, is just talking about, you started an MSP in 96. I mean, that was well before, like, I remember those days and I didn't know what an MSP was. And I was in the IT field. I'm not even going to get into that because I was terrible at it. But I knew, I was doing computer support back then,
Yeah.
and I don't know what an MSP was. So things have changed. Things have changed incredibly just in a couple of years, and they're changing more and more rapidly. So what do you see now that are some key factors in where we are and how we should be approaching things based on where we are now.
So I said all the good things about now. I mean, security has driven up, the average seat price, the average deal size. Our TAM, our total addressable market, is expanding quickly. Like there all those good things, it's the best time. Let me give you the other side of it. It's a much more complex business. You have 40 tools now, instead of 10. Um, the labor market is much tighter than it was through the history, in the past. Not only finding people, but training them is harder based on all those other factors, demands of the customer. So what you need to do is, if you're going to be in this business, you have to become a professional business person now. Where I felt like before, you really didn't need to. You could just eke by, but the opportunity is so big right now. And what we're seeing, Mike, is that gap between the top MSPs, the top 15%, and the bottom 50% is widening because of this. So I always have this joke, like it's the best time in history to be an MSP for 15% of you. But the opportunity is available to 100% of you.
Exactly.
You just have to decide, like, and some of it's not even MSP. A lot of like what we teach in peer is you got to know how to do a proper business plan, right? You got to have an accountability system in place. You got to understand your numbers. You got to drive accountability down to every individual contributor. Whether you have 5 employees or 500, those things are the same. And you have to see your role in a small business. Number one, your job is to grow revenue and profitability. And if you don't act that way, you'll just end up with a job that you can't quit. And maybe that's okay for you, but you're not only making that decision for yourself and your family, you're making it for your employees, because they can only get opportunity if you make the decision to be a professional business person and everything that goes along with that. And by the way, I've watched hundreds of people do it the past 15 years. It's the funnest thing ever. They always say, well, I really like, talking to customers, and I like the technology part of it. I don't like sales, and I don't like the business plan. I don't like all that. Yeah, that's because they weren't good at it. Once they got good at it, they loved it way more. And they went to the bank.
100%. Gary, thanks for being on here. I'm gonna wrap up with a quick short story, and because I want to illustrate something here, and I'll come back around. When I owned another business, not in the MSP industry, but I owned a business, and when I was done after years of struggling and kicking around and having a job that I spent my entire life invested in and pulling nothing out of, I decided, you know what, I got to figure this out. And I went into my industry and I looked at every single peer group I could. I found the best, and it exploded our growth. So I know, number one, that a peer group is going to help you be that 15% that Gary's talking about. Choose to be in that 50, because if you do and you go to the right peer group, TruMethods, TruPeer, you're going to be in that 15%. It's just a decision. So I also know how to identify the right peer group. And I'm telling you, this one, hopefully I'm pointing the right way, is the right peer group. And Gary, tell everybody watching how they can learn more about TruPeer and TruMethods.
Yeah, all you need to do is talk to your Kaseya account manager and tell them you want to learn more about TruPeer, and they will set up a meeting with our TruPeer specialists. And if nothing else during that meeting, they'll ask you some questions and make you think about your business differently. So I appreciate that. My goal wasn't to do a commercial for Peer, but really this is not a commercial for Peer as much as it's a commercial for the opportunity and how much we want everyone to take advantage of this. Like, we're going to look back years from now and say that this market at this time was an historic market to be able, for an entrepreneur to be able to grow a business and take care of his team and his family and her family, all of those things. So that's the message.
Great way to end it. Thank you so much, Gary. It's been an honor talking to you. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
All right, make it
All
a
right, I
great
got to
one.
do that. We'll drop it.